Welcome to our podcast for college Catholics, where we discuss faith and spirituality from a Catholic perspective. I'm Father Patrick. We've been reflecting in these last episodes what the First Commandment encourages us to do and some of the sins against it. Now, one of the derivatives of the First Commandment was the command not to make any images or representations of God. In the book of Deuteronomy, Moses says to the people, "Since you saw no form on the day that the Lord spoke to you at Horeb out of the midst of the fire, beware lest you act corruptly by making a graven image for yourselves in the form of any figure." And that's from Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 15. So God, Yahweh, is the Lord of Lords, the absolutely transcendent being, the infinite, the Almighty, and could not, should not be represented in any way. In fact, there had been already a tendency to fall into idolatry among the people of Israel. Idolatry is the worshipping of images as if they were themselves gods or deities or divinities, like we read in the book of Exodus chapter 32, where the Israelites saw that Moses was taking too long to return from the Mount Sinai, and therefore made a golden calf and adored it as the God who had taken them out of Egypt. Only the true God deserves to be recognized as God and given the worship of adoration. The Old Testament, in different places, and particularly Psalm 115, clearly rejects the adoration of idols or other elements as if they were gods. We read in Psalm 15, verse 4, "The idols are silver and gold, the work of human hands. They have mouths but do not speak, eyes but do not see. They have hands but do not feel, feet but do not walk. Their makers will be like them, and anyone who trusts in them." Up to there, the psalm. So the prohibition to make any type of images of God was to prevent this danger of idolatry. But not every image was forbidden. In fact, in the same Old Testament, there were some other images that were permitted, and even their production was commanded by God. These were not images or statues that were intended to be considered as gods, but they were reminders or symbols of heavenly realities. For example, in the book of Exodus, chapter 21, verse 8, we read that God commands Moses to make a seraph and mount it on a pole, and everyone who has been bitten will look at it and recover. In this case, the serpent, the seraph, was a symbol of the future Messiah, Jesus Christ. They also had to build an ark, the Ark of the Covenant, which is described in Exodus chapter 25, where we also read how they had to make some statues of angels or cherubim, more specifically. We read in Exodus 25, verse 18. "Make 2 cherubim of beaten gold for the 2 ends of the cover. Make 1 cherub at one end, and the other at the other end, of one piece with the cover at each end. The cherubim shall have their wings spread out above, sheltering the cover with them. They shall face each other, with their faces looking toward the cover." So, you can see that the prohibition had a purpose, which was to prevent the people from falling into idolatry by thinking that the statue was the God itself. But they could make images or statues as reminders of other spiritual realities. In fact, during the first centuries after the resurrection of Christ, the church did paint representations of Jesus and the apostles in the walls of different buildings and places of worship. Now, the foundation for this freedom of representing spiritual realities to help our devotion and remind us of our heavenly companions was the fact that Jesus Christ himself had become the visible, the tangible, physical image of God. So there are 2 New Testament passages that are important in this regard. The first one is from the prologue to the Gospel of St. John, chapter 1, verse 14, where St. John specifically says that the Word of God, the Son, the second person of the Holy Trinity, took on a material body, by which he meant a complete human nature. we read, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. We have beheld his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father." That's from St. John, chapter 1. Now, the second text is from the letter of St. Paul to the Colossians, chapter 1, verse 15, where he says that Christ is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. So these are the principles behind the representation of Jesus and the saints. So we can find images of Jesus Christ and the saints painted in the catacombs, in the cemeteries, and in some churches in the first centuries of the history of the church. Later, they started to make mosaics, then reliefs, and eventually statues. Now, an important part in the history of the church happened in the 7th and 8th centuries, where there was a movement in the church that started looking suspiciously at those religious images. St. John Damascene, a great doctor of the church, defended the use and veneration of images of saints. He wrote 3 works called Discourses Against Those Who Calumniate the Holy Images. Now, there was a group of bishops who condemned him for these writings and for defending the veneration of images. Those who opposed the use of images were called iconoclasts. That means those who want to destroy images or icons. And this back and forth, this ensuing problems that happened between those who defended the images and those who attacked them, is called the iconoclastic controversy in history. This anti-image movement came to a climax when the Emperor of Byzantium, Leo III, banned all public veneration of religious images and eventually started a persecution against those who kept images or statues in their churches. This persecution became more violent under the following emperor, Constantine V. Several men and women were tortured and killed for venerating images. Eventually, the church in the 7th Ecumenical Council of Nicaea in 787 solemnly approved the use and the public veneration of images of the saints in prayer and in the liturgy. Now here's what Pope Benedict XVI said about St. John Damascene and this controversy of iconoclasm in the general audience in 2009. I will put a link to this in the show notes below if you're interested, to the whole audience. But this is an excerpt. He said, "The 3 discourses of St. John Damascene were also the fundamental grounds for his rehabilitation and canonization on the part of the Orthodox bishops gathered in the Council of Nicaea in 787 AD. In these texts, it is possible to trace the first important theological attempts to legitimize the veneration of sacred images, relating them to the mystery of the incarnation of the Son of God in the womb of the Virgin Mary." Up to there, Pope Benedict. Now, St. John Damascene himself writes the following about the veneration of images. He says, "In other ages, meaning the Old Testament, God had not been represented in images because he was without a body and without a face. But since God has now been seen in the flesh, meaning through Jesus Christ, and lived among men, I represent that part of God which is visible. I do not venerate matter, but the creator of matter, who became matter for my sake and deigned to live in matter and bring about my salvation through matter. I will not cease, therefore, to venerate that matter through which my salvation was achieved, but I do not venerate it as if it were God." St. John Damascene was also among the first to distinguish in the cult, both public and private, of Christians between the worship of adoration, or latria, and veneration, proskinesis. Those are the Greek terms for adoration and veneration, latria and proskinesis. The first type of cult or worship of adoration and latria can only be offered to God, who is our Creator and God of all. The second, veneration, can make use of an image to address the one whom the image represents. Obviously, the saint represented can in no way be identified with the material of which the icon is composed. Now, this distinction is obviously essential to understand why we can pray to the saints and do it before an image or statue that represents them and reminds us of their heavenly intercession. So we have latria, of adoration, to God, and then veneration, proskinesis, or doulia, to the saints. Now, St. John Damascene died around the year 750, so he did not get to witness his rehabilitation and the official approval by the Church of the veneration of the saints and their images, which was defined by the Council of Nicaea in 787 AD. This council justified and approved the veneration of icons or images of Christ and the saints against the iconoclasts, that is, against those who wanted to eliminate completely that public veneration of images of the saints. The council, the Seventh Ecumenical Council of Nicaea, 787 AD, based this teaching on the fact that Jesus Christ is the image of God made flesh. Because he made himself visible, we are now enabled to make visible representations of those realities that we cannot see. Of course, the honor or veneration given to an image passes to the saint it represents. We always need to remember that important distinction. We are not honoring the image in itself, but we are honoring the saint it represents. As St. Basil says, whoever venerates an image venerates the person portrayed in it. Finally, now this is the moment to remind you of the distinction between the worship of adoration due to God alone and the reverence or veneration which we can give to the angels and the saints. In this sense, the Church distinguishes between adoration, which in Greek is said latria, which is the worship given to God by which we recognize him as our Creator, our God, the Almighty and Infinite, to whom we owe all honor and glory. And on the other hand, veneration, in Greek, doulia, which is the veneration or honor given to the saints and the angels, by which we recognize that they are not God. They are created by God, but they are with God, and they become a model for us to imitate, and they are powerful intercessors before God, in such a way that we can obtain graces more effectively through them than if we were to pray exclusively on our own to God. The Christian veneration of images and the honor given to the saints is therefore not contrary to the First Commandment. And this is why you can pray the rosary or have framed pictures of the saints and of Jesus Christ in your room, or kneel and pray before a statue of the Virgin Mary at your local church. This is a long-standing and venerable tradition of the Church, and you should not be intimidated by those who falsely claim that you're adoring a statue or committing idolatry. So this is all for today. May the Virgin Mary and the saints continue always to pray for us, and may the angels always protect you. Please share this episode with your friends, and if you can, please leave a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And as you also know, now you can also find us on YouTube. So make sure you leave a comment in there as well. Hope to see you next time. May God bless your day.